of Antinori, Renzo Cotarella. Renzo, thanks for being here. It's going to be a lot of fun.
It is always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to talk to you. And we got some wine to talk about. And obviously, it's a very strange world right now. How are you dealing with the whole problem of the harvest? I mean, it's easy to separate workers in farming in the spring. You keep them apart physically. But now you have a harvest that's going to be earlier than normal. And people are used to working in close quarters and sorting tables. So how do you deal with the harvest when you have this sort of a situation?
It will be not easy also because you have to maintain the distances between people, and the problem could be on the sorting table. Of course, we can use also some, let's say, machines to do it, the optical sorting or something like this. But of course, it will be quite complicated to do it. In any case, the advantage, at least at the moment, is that the vintage seems to be quite good. It doesn't seem we need a lot of selection at the moment because especially in Chianti Classico production is quite low and berries are okay. They are not big berries. I mean, it seems to be quite a balanced vintage, and hopefully we are able to manage properly because we have not just the sorting table, we have also the workers in the middle of the vineyard. When you prune the vines, as we did in February or March, you can stay one row and then you leave 2 rows for free and then another row with the worker. But during the harvest, it starts to be very complicated. We hope that the situation will be better, but not just for the harvest, for everyone. We are quite, let's say, tired to live in this difficult period. We don't know that there is a lot of uncertainty, as we are saying now. I mean, we don't know how to approach the harvest, which is complicated, but in any case, we need to do it, and we will do. I mean, of course, we will need also some help from the weather. So let's hope for a good weather in order to allow us to manage the harvest without being under pressure because of the rain.
Yeah, fingers crossed for that. So it's interesting. I was really lucky because when I was a kid, my parents had a wine store. And they sold a lot of Italian wine and Bordeaux Futures were the 2 big categories. And one of the first wines I tasted was this wine, Solaia. And it vintages from the early 90s. So probably like 93, 94. That was my introduction to Solaia. And my dad had me organize the shelves of the store. And that was my job for which I was paid minimum wage. I was paid minimum wage, which I won't say how much it was because it'll date me. But my parents paid me minimum wage, and I organized the wine shelves so that I could buy musical instruments and things. And and I would look at this label, and I always wanted to taste this wine. And then one day I got to taste it. So I've known this wine for a really long time. So it's a wine. Every time I see this label, every time I taste this wine, it makes me think about my parents and their store. And over the years, we've also done some really amazing tastings. We did one at 11 Madison Park.
Fantastic one.
Yeah, it's funny. There's a storm coming today, and it reminds me that the first time we did the Solaia tasting, it got canceled because of Hurricane Sandy. I think it was Sandy.
Yes.
But we had every vintage. When we did it again, when we finally did it about 6 months later, we had every vintage of Solaia at 11 Madison Park. Fabulous menu by Daniel Hume. And then last year we did another one that I think that almost killed some people because I think it was like 28 vintages or something. And, most of us are not used to tasting that many wines in one sitting. Then we did one last year at the Ledbury in London, which sadly will not reopen. We will talk about the restaurant crisis maybe a little bit later. Yeah. I mean, maybe it might, I guess, in the future, but right now the decision is that they're not reopening. So it's quite sad. I'll show some pictures of that. But what always struck me about this wine is that it was a wine that was made by accident, not unlike Sassicaia, which was made as a wine for home consumption and then became an icon.
Yes.
Or Tignanello, Massetto, which was a Merlot planted for fun, and Ornellaia became an icon. And this wine also was sort of created accidentally, has gone on to become an icon. So I think it would be great to hear the story of that. And before I turn it over to you, Renzo, I see we have a question, and I forgot to say that these to our audience. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. The goal of these is to make them as interactive as possible. So please give us your questions as soon as possible so we can weave them into the conversation. We'll get to them right away. But tell us, Renzo, about...
Please, not too difficult, the questions.
No, not too difficult. And they're in English, so it's, well, it's my second language too, so it's pretty fair. But tell us about how Solaia was born, because it's a great story.
Yeah, it was in 78. And we started in 75 to add some Cabernet Sauvignon to the blend of Tignanello. As you know, Tignanello, the first vintage was 71, and it was based practically in nearly 100% Sangiovese. In 75, we decided to add a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon. We planted, we had in the vineyard of Tignanello since many years. And in 78, we decided to use a little bit of Cabernet Sauvignon, but it was a little bit too much. It was too much, and it was able to change the style of Tignanello, so we decided not to use it. At that time, I was not there, of course, even if I started working with Antinori the following year in 79. But we decided to bottle some Cabernet Sauvignon alone to see the evolution of this wine, and that was 78. As a matter of fact, the first vintage of Solaia we released was not 78, but was 79. Because we realized in 78 that the wine was good, but there was still a lot to improve. And the first vintage of Solaia was 79 as Cabernet Sauvignon, 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. We released 78 after 82. So 78 was bottled by chance. And if you see the bottle of 78, a simple bottle of Santa Cristina, Villa Antinori. It was not the original bottle of Solaia, the regular bottle, because we bottled just to see the evolution of this wine. And, it was interesting. And I must say, the final blend was then in 85 with a touch of Cabernet Franc and also Sangiovese. But the first three vintages were 100% Cabernet Sauvignon. The last vintage we made using 100% Cabernet Sauvignon was 2002. Where, we were able not to produce any, let's say, reserve using Sangiovese because the vintage.
Yeah, that one is the one that says anno particolare, no? Something like that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so where did the cuttings come from for Cabernet Sauvignon? Because it's not customary to have these in Tuscany, unless it's Carmignano, but obviously you didn't get the material from there. So
no.
Where?
In our history, the Cabernet Sauvignon was planted at Tignanello in the middle of 20. So we had this vineyard of Tignanello of Cabernet since many years. And we propagate these bats, reproducing, this Cabernet that was very good. So, that was planted, I think, by the Marchese Niccolò, the Piero Antinori's father.
Yeah, so I think one of the really fascinating aspects of the Antinori family is the things that people don't know. Remind me how many generations it is now, 30 something.
26 with Alberto and Alessia, but the 27th generation just started working with us.
Okay.
Vittorio, and I hope soon also Verdiana.
27 generations. So Vinous is still on first generation. We have a little catching up to do. 400 years, But Piero Antinori is because he's such a shy and reserved man that people don't know how influential he has been and was to a lot of leading estates, that he bottled his cousin's first vintages of Sassicaia.
Yes.
And that he helped the Napoli family develop Rampolla, which used to be a big grape supplier to the Antinori family.
Yes.
There are many other cases where he had a very big role in those estates during their formative years.
Piero Antinori really helped a lot, many producers, by also providing all the technical, let's say, support, by having Giacomo Tagis at that time, that used to be our winemaker. And through Giacomo Tagis, we did a lot of support to other producers, Sassicaia and Rampolla, as you said, many others, and not just in Tuscany. Because, I think, but also Piero Antinori always told that to have several producers that are able to produce great wine is an advantage for the region, and so in a certain sense is an advantage for everybody. And if you think what happened through Solaia, through Sassicaia and Tignanello, that they were able to really establish the super Tuscans. And now most of the growers, they have a great advantage of having this sort of category, which is not just, great in terms of quality, but also quite expensive and so quite profitable. And also they were able to establish Tuscany as a great region, of course, together with all the appellations, Chianti Classico, Brunello, Bolgheri, and many others. But the Super Tuscan were really instrumental to build the reputation of Tuscany around the world.
Yeah, and so I think the Super Tuscans divide into at least two different categories, right? There's the wines that are made from international varieties. So the reason I don't use that word a lot is because I think it's very confusing. There's two kinds of Super Tuscans. There's the wines like Solaia and Sassicaia that are made from either 100% international grapes or a blend of international and native grapes like Solaia, which has some Sangiovese, but that word Super Tuscan also gets applied to the 100% Sangiovese wines that were made outside of the Chianti Classico appellation, like Flaccianello, Pergoletorpe, Ceparello. So it's a bit of not necessarily a very well-defined category. But I think a lot of people may not know that this wine is from vineyards in Chianti Classico.
Which is very important.
So tell us about your estate there, because you're at altitude. The vineyards are very steep. What is it about Tignanello that is, for you though, that really are the most important things for the wine?
Tignanello is, I think what I really love in the production of Tignanello is the vibrancy and the energy of the wine, of the grapes, and consequently of the wines. They are wines that really are vertical, they push a lot, and they have this energy and this vibrancy, which is really unique. I must say, this is the vineyard, yes.
Yeah, forgive me if I'm a little nostalgic, but I missed my trip to Tuscany this year, and I took this picture at sunset last year.
And this vineyard very well. I remember we walked around the vineyard to really to feel the place. And this is a fantastic place because we are in a very steep hill, a very weak soil, a lot of rocks, Galestro and Alberese, very, weak in a certain sense vines, but with this character, with this intensity, which is unique. At Tignanello, even if you taste the Solaia 2017, you don't really taste the massive, the body, the richness in terms of a really rich body of this wine. But in any case, there is a touch of elegance, a touch of grace, which is typical of Tignanello. And this vibrancy, this energy that you find in a wine like this. You recognize the wine coming from Tignanello from the nose. You don't need to taste because they are quite pungent in a certain sense. They are more red than black. There is this fruit, which is always fresh. And this is unique. I'm saying not just because I make this wine, but really wines coming from Tignanello, they have a soul which is specific, which is classic of Tignanello. And in a certain sense, it remembers to me the soul of Chianti Classico. Sometimes we forget that. I think Chianti Classico as a wine region is one of the best in the world. For sure, for the style that the region is able to give to the wine, I think it's the best expression of fresh, energetic, intense Sangiovese. I really like very much Chianti Classico. Of course, maybe because we live here, we are accustomed to taste this wine, but I think a great Chianti Classico, a great Sangiovese coming from Chianti Classico is really a great wine. It's a unique wine.
Yeah, I want to come back to that in a second. I think just for the sake of people watching, Tignanello is both the name of an estate and a wine, right? So the Tignanello is the property.
Yes.
And within Tignanello, you make now what is the Chianti Classico that's just from that property.
Yes, which is Marchese Antinori.
Yeah, Marchese Antinori. You make the Tignanello wine, the wine called Tignanello, and then you make Solaia, correct?
Antonio, I lost you.
So
Say?
I just want to make sure that everyone watching understands that, because we use these words somewhat interchangeably. Tignanello is both a place and a wine. Tignanello is this tenuta, this property. You make the Marchese Antinori Chianti Classico from this estate. You make the wine called a Tignanello.
From the vineyard of Tignanello.
Yeah, and then you make Solaia from Tignanello.
The vineyard of Solaia, yes. So in this estate, we make 3 wines, as you say: Tignanello, Solaia, and Marchese Antinori, and Chianti Classico. Of course, Tignanello is from the vineyard of Tignanello, Solaia is from the vineyard of Solaia, and Chianti Classico comes from the other vineyard, which are around Tignanello and Solaia.
Right, and then
we are, just to give you an idea, you asked me about the altitude. We are between, let's say, 1,300 feet to 1,500 feet. This is the level of altitude, and it means a lot in terms of style. It has always this touch of acidity, this touch, of vibrancy, of this touch of verticality, which is unique, also due to the altitude.
Right, and a couple of other things that I think are important is to notice you're in the northern part of Chianti Classico, so close to Florence. Yes. Whereas if you go down to near Siena, where Felsina is, for example, or closer to San Giusto Rentenano, for example, you get wines that are have much more body and much more breadth. And we were talking before we went live, but we'll talk about the 17 in a second, but that wine from a very dry vintage is still very fresh. And I think that must be the altitude and the northern location of Tignanello in the Chianti Classico zone, because it'll take you, for you, it's probably like a half an hour, but for an American person like me, it's a good hour to get from the north to the south.
Yes. No. You are right. I mean, once you move towards Siena, in a certain sense, you move toward Montalcino. So you have a different intensity of the grapes, a different intensity of the wine, but still remaining a little bit vertical, as Chianti Classico is. Of course, close to the Florentine area of Chianti Classico, going to the, let's say, highest part of Chianti Classico, Radda, also Greve, some places of Gaiole, you have this fresh fruit, which is unique, and really is able to characterize the grapes and the wine coming from this area. This is the reason why inside Chianti Classico we have been thinking about the possibility of dividing the Chianti Classico in sub-regions according to the municipality. This is one of the projects we hope we are going to close soon. Because I think even inside Chianti Classico, as you said before, there are differences which are quite, evident in a certain sense.
Yeah. And so, I don't know, about 15 years ago or 10 years ago, something like that, I started to do a lot of vertical tastings of the wines of Chianti Classico. That was back still when I worked for Robert Parker. And I published all of these verticals, Pergole Torte and the Castello di Ama wines and Felsina Arancia. And that's when I started to think that maybe Chianti Classico was the most important terroir in Tuscany for age-worthy wines, which I'm sure will upset some of our people in Montalcino and Bolgheri. But when I think about how the wines age, and you taste not just the important wines, but you taste a straight Chianti Classico or a Riserva that is not necessarily meant to be this pedigreed wine, and you taste them when they're 20, 25 years old, some of these wines can be fabulous. So, I agree with you. I've written this, a long time ago, so it's no surprise. But I think that there's some amazing terroirs, obviously, in Chianti Classico, just by how the wines have aged. And I've been lucky to be able to do those tastings, for a long time.
No, and I fully agree. On the other side, we have to say that we are discussing about style. It's not a matter of quality. Each one of us prefers a certain style of wine. And I agree with you that the style of Chianti Classico and the ability of this style to age for a long time is really great. I love the style of Chianti Classico. I love this freshness, this verticality, let's say, this pungency of Sangiovese coming from Chianti Classico. Then we have not to forget that. Because, when we talk about Bolgheri, we talk about international varieties. In Chianti Classico, we talk mostly about Sangiovese. But even with international variety, in Chianti Classico, you have a completely different wine. just to give you an example, which is more, chemical, but it's clear as an example. If you have Cabernet or Merlot in Chianti Classico, very rarely you have a pH which is over 3.5. If you have Cabernet or Merlot in Bulgari, very rarely you have a pH which is lower than 3.7. So there is a completely different approach, a completely different fruit. You have dark fruit in Bulgari, you have fresh fruit and red fruit, even with international varieties in Chianti Classico. There is a completely different approach and completely different style. And that made the two areas completely different. And of course, interesting. Because exciting also to taste and to try to understand why.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so let's talk about Solaia. So this wine, when did you know? It sort of predates you because you arrived in the mid '90s. But when did the Antinoris know that they had a special wine, a wine that was maybe better than initially expected?
I think at the beginning of '80s, we realized that we were in a great area. For me, I started being interested in Solaia with the '90 vintage. So I was lucky because I started with the right one. But then after a couple of years, I had also the '92, and we didn't produce any Solaia in '92. I think the perception of having a great wine goes together with your ability to understand nuances. A great wine is based on nuances, on something more, something different, something which is unique or in a certain sense represents the soul of the wine. I think probably I realized to be in front of a great place to produce a great wine in '94. You were discussing before that maybe one of the first vintage you tested was '94. I think '94 was a great Solaia. And even when we had the last couple of tasting, '94 really was always a great wine. But probably '97 and '99, they confirmed that we were in front of a great wine. But for me and for all our team, we needed a lot of vintages to really be fully, I don't say involved, but to really understand how to manage grapes from Solaia. As we said before, it's a matter of nuances. Sometimes a matter of culture. It's not just based on your ability to taste, but also it's based on the culture you have about wine and what is the goal you want to achieve with a wine like this. And probably, I must say, '94, '97, '99, 2001, 2004, they were all great vintage, but talking about this vintage now, I think I was not able to extract anything I could from vintage like this for a problem of culture. I must say, I feel much more comfortable now in the last 10 years to manage grapes properly. And also all our team is much more accustomed to manage, the right grapes now, how to manage grapes, how to ferment the wine, which are the barrel we have to use. We discussed many times with you about the possibility, about the ability to choose the best for the best. And sometimes the best is not the most expensive, but is the one that fit with your idea of wine you want to produce. And I think now we are much more knowledgeable about Solaia than we were maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Even a vintage like '97 is a result of this knowledge. It's the result of all the trials we have done, all the experiment, all the experience we have done, and that will never finish. Because there is always something, I don't say to adjust, but to improve. Always something. And barrels, for instance, are very important. The way how you, macerate the grapes, the temperature of fermentation, the pumping over, the punching down, how you want to extract the tannins. There are many variables you have to understand, and you have to apply according to the vintage. There is not a recipe. There is not, a process you have to do always with the same rules. There are no rules. There is a feeling. There is a sensitivity. There is something that really is able or are able together allow you to, to do what you have to do. And this is the reason why making wine, especially at a certain level, is so exciting, because you have to, I don't say invent, but every year you have to think of how you can extract as much as you can from the vintage. Yeah. And Solaia is really one of the most difficult, because we have 3 varieties. Cabernet Sauvignon, of course, is 75%. In this case, it's 73%. Then we have Cabernet Franc. We started to add more and more to Cabernet, to this wine, to this blend, and then we have 20% Sangiovese. Why we have been looking about Cabernet Franc, because I think Cabernet Franc is able to balance the wine quite well, especially in vintage like 2017. To have a little bit of Cabernet Franc more, allow the wine to be more accessible without tannins too aggressive, and to make a wine, I don't say sweet, but soft or softer, especially at the entrance. So without, without having a wine too rough, that sometimes using Cabernet Sauvignon, especially in a vintage like 2017, you can have. So I really enjoy a lot when we taste Solaia, when we try to understand how to, what is the best interpretation of the vintage. And I must say, we have a wonderful team. Stefano, Sara, Dora, all Pietro, all the people we have there, even if they are young, they are there since several years. And several means 20 or 18 or 15. Some of those, maybe 5, 6, but they really are able to understand clearly the potential of the grapes, the potential of the place, and it is quite easy to work with them and to work with all the workers that are in the winery, that they know exactly how to do it. Because we do some direction, but then you have to do manually. And when you do the punching down, you must have clear what you have to do. And there is the worker that do this. That's the punching down. You can say, do a punching down. It seems simple, but in the case of 2017, it was quite complex, because tannins were there, grapes were very concentrated, we had very low crop, because frost and drought, frost in April and drought during the summer, so low crop, small berries, very strong concentration, and we had to work a lot in order to avoid the extraction of tannins that were too aggressive, too rich, in a certain sense rough. And I think 17, considering the vintage, in the case of Solaia, is quite a refined wine. It's not a heavy wine, it's not a massive wine, not at all.
Yeah, if anything, this wine still needs cellaring. But you said something interesting. It's obviously very young, but you said something interesting at the beginning, which is you talked about some of these vintages like 90, 94, 97. I remember when I was a kid, the idea of a great vintage was a warm vintage. And today, what is a great vintage is a cool vintage with a long growing season, 2004, 2010, 2013, 2016. So why is that? Is it because the warm vintages of like 1990 would be considered cool today because of climate change? Or is it that the concept of making wine has evolved over time, or is it all of that?
No, we have to consider a series of elements. One is that in the 80s, most of the varieties, most of the selection was made in order to have variety or clones that they were able to ripe earlier in order to escape the fall. Second,
because it rained in the fall and that could compromise your harvest.
Exactly. Yeah. Second, so it was really important to have an early maturation. Second, we really increased a lot the density in the vineyard, especially when we planted in the middle of 90s. We increased a lot and that that create a lot of competition between the vines, and as the vines are much dense, the density is much higher, we had to reduce the distance between the soil and the clusters. And having the soil, which is warm, the soil, let's say, hit the cluster. and we have an acceleration of maturation.
Can I jump in there for a second? Because this was when people thought that the best approach to farming was to stress the vineyard. And the one way that you stress the vineyard is by planting very dense, and it's a very Darwinian survival of the fittest sort of model, right?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the way people thought in the 90s. It was very common in Bordeaux, California, Napa, Indio. Because I think one of the interesting things is how these different concepts apply to various regions in the world at the same time. They're not just isolated in one place. So in the 90s, that was the philosophy. Let's stress the vines, survival of the fittest. You have to plant your vineyard lower. That also means you have less canopy on top for protection. All the things that you want now.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Together with the global warming, because we have to also to consider that, and with varieties that are able to ripe earlier, I mean, closer to the soil, less production per vine. All these things really stress the vines too much and accelerating too much the maturation, and consequently, quite often you have, let's say, a dichotomy between sugar and tannins and flavor, because sometimes we forget to talk about flavor, because we say sugar and tannins and flavor remains where it is. No, flavor is important. You have to decide based on that. So I think we have to revisit our, let's say, approach to the vineyard. And this is the reason why now having vintage a little bit longer and a little bit cooler is an advantage. Because, I mean, we stress the vines too much. I don't think that we are able to produce well as people under stress. We have to be in tension, but not stressed. And I think the vines is the same. And sometimes we stress too much. I mean, I was, Sunday, I was visiting some vineyard at Castello della Sala. And there are vines planted between, let's say, 4 feet by 9 feet, not irrigated, and vines planted 3 feet by 7, irrigated. The vines not irrigated were healthier than the ones that are irrigated. I mean, they suffered less because of the competition. So we have to reconsider that. And at the same time, having vines which are a little bit less dense, you can increase the height. You can have the, cluster a little bit higher than the soil, because you have the distance between the row and you have the sun that is able to touch the clusters. And that allows also the vines and the grapes to ripe better because they are fresher. And so it's a sort of analyzation of the grapes that I think should be taught in a certain sense for the future. And there is also all the clonal selection that has to be rethought again, because with the global warming, we need clones that are able to ripe regularly. We cannot pick grapes at the beginning of September. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, this is true in other parts of the world too. Burgundy comes to mind. In the 90s, it was all about early ripening clones. And now you want the exact opposite. The only problem is it takes 20 years for a vineyard to be mature or more. And by the time you know this, a lot of time has passed. That's why I don't make wine. A lot of times people say, why don't you make wine? It's because I don't like this long learning curve. But we have a question about this, about clones. So do you prefer, when you're planting a new vineyard, using a clone, or do you prefer taking something from your own vineyard and propagating, like more of a Massal approach?
In the case of Tignanello and Solaia, we have most of the vineyard are master selection. We selected our best vines and we propagate our best vines, and I think we had a better result. But even the Chardonnay, going back to Umbria, let's say, where we produce Cervaro, we recently planted most of the vineyard with master selection. Because again, we have to, I think, to achieve complexity, you must mix different, let's say, clones, different DNA in a set to really express the race, to express the breed of the variety. And even planting clones, we should plant many clones together, not just 1 or 2 clones. But the master selection, I think, is something we have to rethink about. So I am really in favor, especially where you have a result in terms of quality with some variety, to propagate variety. I mean, the selection you have on place.
Okay. I think it'd be fun to take some questions because as we have some really great questions, and I think that they're relevant to not just Solaia, but to a bunch of a number of other wines too. One of the things that you have done in the last handful of years or so is really become an estate producer. Even the Villa Antinori is 100% estate fruit,
Exactly.
which is remarkable for a wine that has produced something like 2.5 million bottles or something more or less, right?
Yes.
So when did that happen? And is it, are all the, I mean, there's a question about the top wines being estate, but I think the important point is it's not just the top wines, it's all of the wines in most of these properties now are completely estate, correct?
I mean, all the wines under the Antinori label, they are produced by using our grapes, 100% of our grapes, no discussion. But, you know, it started at the beginning of 90s. I think for different reasons. Of course, Pierre Antinori has been always very close to the vineyard. I mean, he's a man that really loves to spend time in the vineyard. And as you know, also myself, I'm an agronomist. I'm not a winemaker. I became a winemaker. I was obliged to become a winemaker because if you want to grow grapes properly, you have to know exactly what you want to do with the grapes. Otherwise, instead of producing wine grapes, you have to produce table grapes. So you have to really understand the wine if you want to produce properly the grapes that you use for this wine. So, and for us, for both of us, it was really vital to think about a company like Antinori that had to become a producer. It was very complicated, also expensive in a certain sense, but very complicated also because, as you know, in Europe, it is impossible to plant new vineyards. So we had to use in the past. Now it would have been impossible to do it because now even the rights are not anymore available. But at that time, in order to plant vineyard, we had to buy rights. So we were able to buy rights everywhere in Italy, to plant in Tuscany, to plant in the best place we had in Tuscany, to buy land in the best place in Tuscany in order to achieve this goal, which for us, it was not just a matter of quality. It is not just a matter of identity, but it was a certain sense, an insurance of our life. We were discussing about Antinori 26, 27 generation, how you can assure the next generation if you don't produce your grapes, how they're able to give continuity to the wine they produce, how they can improve the quality if they don't have the ownership of the vineyard. And so for us, was really vital to do it. It was complex, expensive, but really exciting. I mean, it was probably one of the best times of my life.
So on that subject, I think it's interesting because especially right now with an economic picture that's very uncertain, I think it puts a lot of stress on wineries, especially family-owned wineries, where you might have competing interests. So how do you make sure that your winery can get over, and I don't mean financially, but just from a culture standpoint, how do you ensure that you can weather a storm like this? Because, I mean, Antinori's got 26 generations, but not all families do. And I mean, how do you make sure that even if we have a protracted period of difficulty, that you don't have competing factions within families? Because this is what causes a lot of properties to be sold.
Yes. As you know, most of the company, just in the wine company, most of the company are sold, 98% of the company are sold during the second generation. So I mean, this is the reality. This survey, they say that. In our case, I think wine is something different. I think we have to teach the next generation to have passion for this product. Because one of the reasons sometimes where, I mean, the second generation or the third or the fourth generation, they sell the business because they lose passion. So I think we are lucky because the wine is really a passionate product. We are, in a certain sense, lucky because we are in the, let's say, high-end quality business of wine. Mm. So we don't produce, commodities. We produce great wine coming from different places with different character. And we try to make our, let's say, children in a certain sense, passionate about wine, in order for them to see this business like, an enjoyable one, not just a business to make money, but a business to enjoy doing it. And this is the only thing we can do. We cannot stop our future by, let's say, you have to stay in this business forever. What we have done is we have a trust that really will be able to maintain the property as it is for at least 100 years. But having said that, the only way I think we can, the only thing we can do is, again, try to build passion. And I think also in that sense, we have the 3 daughters, Adele, Allegra, and Alessa, they have 6 children, and it seems they are all passionate about wine. That is really important. And we have to do as much as we can also to make the company more fashionable, in order for them to really have clear that it's a great opportunity, it's a great luck to be in this business in a company like this.
So going back to the wine, I think, this wine has had some really interesting stylistic evolutions. In the beginning, it was blended early. Then for a number of years, you aged the components separately, blended them at the end, I think from about 2004 to 2010 or so, more or less. And then you went back to blending it early. Tell us about some of the stylistic evolutions of Solaia in all of these years.
We decided at the beginning to separate the single lot because we wanted to understand better each single parcel. As you know, we have our winery of Solaia, we have tanks of 50 hectoliters, 5 tons of grapes, which is exactly more or less a couple of acres, 1 hectare. And we vinify each hectare in 2 acres in each tank, in order to understand specifically the character of this single small place. And we were obliged to do it in order to understand better the style we were able to achieve. And we didn't blend each single lot for this reason. Then we realized that there was something in common between different, let's say, lots. And there were lots that were able to add some more complexity or more elegance, and other that were able to add more structure, more body. So now we know exactly how to manage them. And in a certain sense, to blend earlier is an advantage because you can use also the right barrels according to the vintage. We do something which is, I think, nearly unique. Most of the winery, they buy the barrel before the harvest because they have to order the barrel. Say, okay, for the next harvest, I need this and this and this and this. We do the opposite. We buy barrels for Solaia according to the vintage. And according to the vintage, we chose different barrels based on the history, on the experience we have done in the previous vintages. And in this vintage, for instance, we have changed a little bit also the barrel profile in order to have barrel less invasive. We didn't need to do it. We need to have barrel more sweet, in a sense, more, as I say, less invasive, more elegant, in order to reduce the intensity and the body of the wine, or not to express too much the tannins of the wine. Now I think we have a certain knowledge how to trade the wine. We have this tool also because the quantity is quite small, so we can do it easily. We are not able to do 100% with Tignanello because we have a different quantity. With Tignanello we do 50%, but in the case of Solaia we chose our barrel, 100% of our barrels after the harvest. We prefer to do the marolati in 1-year-old barrels and then make the blend. And once we do the blend, we use the barrel we think are the most appropriate for a wine like this by putting the wine in new barrels in January or February. This is I think it helped a lot to give stylistic continuity to the wine. On the other side, we have to recognize that our palate changes. We don't have a palate that remains the same forever. Even for us, for Piero Antinori, for myself, and also for the older team, we have to say, making what I want to say simple, that we passed from, let's say, Australia or Bordeaux to Burgundy. So more and more, I think our palate tends to prefer wine a little bit more refined, with more grace, more integrated. Maybe not having a big body, but preferring a blend based on your palate. It's not, again, there is not a rule, there is not a recipe. We taste the wine and we decide to do the blend, and as it happened with food, with cars, with many things, with Thai. I mean, we change by the time also our preference, and we try to make the wine we like most. There are no other ways to make wine. You have to do the blend you like.
Yeah, and the Coopers have also changed their toast levels. You know, what used to be a heavy toast, 10 years ago is now lighter than it used to be. So everything is constantly adapting and changing. It's nothing that nothing stands still, So
exactly. Also, I mean, the age of the staves now are different. They have, I mean, I remember many years ago, I mean, the choice was French oak, non-French oak. Now inside the French oak, you have 2 years old, 3 years old, the toasting more or less, more plus, more or less, and that different coopers. And I think, I mean, if you have the chance to taste different coopers, different barrel where you age the same wine, I mean, the difference are impressive. Impressive. I mean, it seems really a completely different wine. And that is very useful. I don't think the wood is something that changed the wine, but for sure, as we always say, to make a great wine, you need a great grapes, but great grapes are not enough, are not sufficient.
So what are the main coopers that you would usually use for Solaia?
I mean, depends on the vintage, but just to give an idea, we use for Solaia more and more, mostly two coopers that are, one is Taranso, another one is Remon. They have a completely different approach to the wine. Remon is more aggressive in a certain sense, more bright, and Taranso is sweeter, but depends also the typology of barrels, because if you have T5, you have an approach. If you have 103 and plus, you have another. If you have 102, you have another. So it depends on the wine you have to age in barrels. In the case of Solaia, for instance, 17, we have used a little bit of Taranso 103 and plus that are sweeter than the other in order to balance the tannins of the vintage.
Right, because what's really interesting in tasting this wine is, you think about this vintage as being very dry. There was good temperature excursion at the end of the season, so it's not like one of those years that has a very hot end of season, which is really difficult to deal with because you're doing the harvest in heat. That's very hard. But the wine has a medium-bodied structure, not an opulent structure, and the tannin is a little nervous right now in the finish, which is kind of surprising. So I could see that you would want to have a sweeter barrel that could give you a little bit more softness, no?
Exactly. I mean, the wine, the 2017 was rich enough. So we had to manage grapes, as I said before, and wine in order to make it a little bit more, with more grace. I don't want to use the elegance as a word, but more grace, with more balanced. And so this is the reason why the wine is still, it is not really overripe. It is not really massive, not muscular, but it maintains, as you say, a touch of pungency, which I really like in Solaia, which is also the characteristic of Solaia. As we said before, Tignanello and Solaia, both of them, considering the place, considering, I mean, the vineyard, they have always this touch of pungent note, I mean, fresh note that really make this wine a little bit unique. On the other hand, we have to recognize that the place, and Solaia in particular, is able to produce wine a little bit shy. So it means that they need time to develop. They need time to express what they are. And someone says a little bit austere. I don't want to use austere because the wine is not austere. The wine needs time, needs to acquire confidence in a certain sense. And I think this is the reason why it needs time to develop, to age. But I think the characteristic of a great wine is also its ability to age.
Yeah,
it's not a great wine that is not able to age for a long time.
No, for sure.
Like people getting old, You have to
Yeah,
maintain.
you're not old. What is the production of Solaia?
I mean, usually we produce between, let's say, 5,000 cases to 7,000 cases. We had less production in 2016 and 17. 15 was better because the vintage was more, let's say, available, let's say, more easy in a certain sense. So we had in 15, we produced a little bit more than 80,000 bottles, so 7,000 cases. But the average production is between, let's say, 5 to 7,000 cases.
Okay.
And we would like to produce more. I mean, the maximum production of Solaia was, seems strange to say that, in 97. In 97, we were able to produce 9,000 cases. That was the maximum production of Solaia. But I mean, now with Solaia, we are a little bit more strict. We try to select more. We want to really maintain the style of the wine and the quality in a very high level. I think we just bought a 2018, and I think, I mean, the 18 is the lowest quantity we have produced.
Wow.
Because we had to select a lot, but I think the 18, I mean, I hope sooner or later you were able to travel, or I'm able to travel, and we will test together the 18, and the 18 is Solaia and Tignanello for different reasons. I mean, it's really a great vintage, really great. Small quantity, that's okay.
Okay.
I mean, also because when you sell a bottle of wine at that level of price, I mean, you must have quality.
Yeah.
And that is another reason why I think company had to be very careful not to take advantage of the image of the wine, of the price of the wine. But if they want to stay in this business forever, they have to be very respectful of the consumers. So they have to offer a great wine once they decide to sell a wine expensive as Solaia is.
Yeah, for sure. Let me ask you, you have in the Antinori family, in the umbrella, there are a lot of wineries. You have Prunotto in Piedmont, you have in Tuscany, you have obviously everything in Chianti Classico, you have Guado al Tasso, you have Le Mortelle, you have a vineyard, you have a winery in Montepulciano, you have Tormaresca in Puglia. How much, and you have winemaker, you talked about the importance of team. You've got a great group of people, many of whom I've met in these different properties. How much oversight do you give each of these winemakers, or are they on their own to sort of determine the style of the wines and what they want to do, and you're just kind of there to give a hand, or are you actively giving direction to each of these teams?
I think the style of a wine belongs to the company, to the family. It doesn't belong to the winemaker. We cannot have the risk to change our style because we change winemaker. So the stylistic direction has to be given by the family. And in that sense, I must say, Piero Antinori is always there to really have clear what is the direction of the wine in terms of style. We are not talking about quality, because quality has to be there in any case. But the discussion is about style. So even if we have, let's say, many, technicians, many winemakers, vineyard manager, we are more than 40. Of course, there is, a direction which is clear, and we have a central team where we have 3 winemakers and 3 vineyard managers that have a control of the style of each single property, even if, I must say, the last word has to be given to the local winemaker. Because, I mean, people that produce wine, they must feel the wine is there. Otherwise, they don't live with passion what they have to do. So it's a sort of federation, let's say. There is an identity, and there is the freedom to work properly, but at the same time, I mean, all the team is able to teach, in a certain sense, to share all the experience with everybody. Because the experience you can do with Nebbiolo in Piedmont sometimes could be very useful for Aglianico in Puglia. Why people have not to share opinion and experiences. And I think that is very helpful for us. First of all, because everybody, when we taste wine, they are curious to taste also other wines, and they improve their ability to taste by tasting other wines coming from different places. I always say that in order to improve your ability to taste, you should taste champagne.
Okay.
Because it's one of the most difficult products to taste and to understand and to find. And I think in order to grow in improving your ability to taste, you should taste champagne continuously. It seems stupid, because maybe someone thinks that this is really stupid. I think for me, it was really, really useful to try to understand nuances, small things.
You mean champagne, or do you mean Van Clair when the wines are still?
Van Clair, they're complicated.
Yeah.
Even better. But, I don't have so many opportunities to do it. So I have to...
that's hard. That's really hard.
Yeah.
One last question that a few people have asked. Obviously, in Italy, it's easier to move around within the country, but how are you managing your projects outside the United States, in California and Washington? Are you able to travel, or is it all like we're doing now with samples being sent across the ocean and a lot of...
Until a few months ago, I was able to travel 3 or 4 times in California and Washington State. That I love. I love also as a place, and I love to exchange experience with our colleagues there. So I really followed this project since the beginning. I've been coming to California since '85 every year. So I know quite well the area. I tasted many wines there, and we replanted all the vineyard. I know exactly what we replanted, where, why, all the clones, the rootstock. Quite well. I'm also, because it's my job. Even if I have you introduce me as a CEO, I would prefer to be introduced as a, let's say, winemaker, or even better, as an agronomist.
Okay.
Because this is what I really like. And I go quite often there. Again, we had the fortune to have great people there with a wonderful experience in Napa Valley, but also in Washington State. And they are 2, let's say, estates where we were able to learn a lot. Of course, in the last 6 or 7 months, they send samples, so we do seminars, we discuss, we see picture. It's a little bit frustrating in a certain sense, stressing, but for a few months, we are still able to manage. Of course, we cannot manage things by staying seated here and see picture of vineyard. It doesn't work like this. I tell you something which is funny. Every year, I give a present to most of the worker, all the winemaker and the vineyard manager, and I give jacket and boots, in order to have clear what we have to do. We have to stay outside, we have to see what happened in the vineyard. We can take advantage of all the instrument, all the picture of the satellite, but we have to really understand where we are, and we have to stay with our workers in order for us to teach them and to learn from them what we need. And you cannot do this job by be sitting in a desk. It doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work at all. It's all about being in the vineyards. Obviously, we've walked those vineyards many times, and you really see, for example, how steep it is at Tignanello, the estate, and the rocks and the soils. Lorenzo, the head agronomist of Antinori, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. We could spend a whole afternoon talking about wines. There's a lot of questions and a lot of topics to go over, but I really enjoy spending time with you as always. Next time, I hope it's in person. If there's an extra bottle of 78 Solaia somewhere, I'd love to taste it again.
We will test for sure. I hope that this situation will finish soon, and we will be able to start again to embrace each other and to live as we used to live a few months ago. And that was our life. And I hope we are going to be in this condition as soon as possible. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, everybody. I hope everybody, people that listen us are not bored, I hope. And let's enjoy the last drop of Solaia. And thank you again